but it looks like Aune. So every time anyone asks me what my name is, I always have to spell it as well. Anyway, it was really lovely to be here. We, as Natalie said, we set up the network probably a year and a half ago now. And this is our second major event. So we had an event in London in December 2012, was it? Yes. When we launched. And so we've got an email list and we've got a Facebook page and we've got a Twitter account. So do follow us or like us. We're interested in more people getting involved as well. So joining the collective, also hosting events, running events in your area, maybe having things like, reading group or trips to a kind of other feminist activist events that we can then go and bring a kind of Christian presence within. So we're going to the Million Women Rise March in London next Saturday, and anyone who'd like to come with us would be really welcome. We've got a banner, I think. Have we got a banner or are we making a banner? We've made some banners. But we'll tell you about that later. So I'm going to talk now about the research that I did with Catherine Redfern, who is the founder of the brilliant feminist blog, The F Word, which I guess probably most people in here will know about. So it's the fword.org.uk. That was set up about 10 years ago. And we had been involved in lots of different feminist groups, Catherine and I, and we wanted to do some research on who these groups were, was there a resurgence, what's the evidence of this, partly to challenge a lot of the myths in the mainstream media that people weren't interested in feminism anymore, that feminism had kind of died. And so this is the book that we wrote together. This is the second edition. We published the first edition in 2010, and then the publishers asked us to update it, so that's got some more material. It's got a new chapter in the introduction. So I'm going to talk about what we found in our research. It's about the resurgence of grassroots feminism, mostly in Britain, but also in other countries too. Now, you will probably have noticed, those of you who are, avid readers of, followers on feminist stories on Twitter or followers of stories about feminism in the media, that actually in the last couple of years quite a few books have been published about feminism or from a feminist perspective, and which this has been fabulous. There hadn't really been anything before this group of books for about 10 years really, apart from Germaine Greer's book The Whole Woman, published in 1999. So people seem to be getting the message again that feminism is back and is important, that there are still gender inequalities. But when we were writing our book, we were responding to a lot of attacks on feminism that we'd heard by various public figures. So newspapers having, headlines such as these. The bra burning always comes up. You can never quite escape that one, despite the fact that it never actually happened. No one ever burned their bras. Again, as you may know that. My particular favourite of these headlines was the flower arranging ones. Will always trump feminism. And of course that's associated with the church, isn't it? Again, which is quite an interesting one. So people on the political right tend to criticise feminism for having gone too far, whilst the political left bemoan the absence of feminism amongst young people. Now, I think that these media stereotypes do affect how people see feminism. Some interesting research by an academic called Kristin Aune, who is based at King's College London, where she interviewed British and German women about what they thought about feminists, and found that they mostly, about 3/4 of them, didn't see themselves as feminists, and they mostly identified feminism as something that was unfeminine, that was about hating men, and that was about being a lesbian. But then when she said to them, well, can you think of anyone who actually fits this description? Unsurprisingly, no one could. And so she makes the argument that by making these negative comments, the women were trying to show that they themselves were more socially acceptable, that they represented a kind of socially acceptable, sort of heterosexual, conventionally attractive femininity. And of course, not only is that homophobic, but it also uses racial and religious stereotyping. So Sharf's interviewees talked about how we don't need feminism now in the UK or in Europe, because women can achieve equality if they want to, unlike in Muslim countries where everyone is, hopelessly oppressed and in need of feminism. So there are a lot of problematic stereotypes about feminism that are also linked to racial stereotyping, to religious stereotyping too. And these stereotypes need to be challenged. So we set out in our book to do this. And our book, again, I think was distinctive in that it tried to be quite optimistic about what was happening with feminism. So it's easy when you're... my day job is that I'm a lecturer in sociology, and so... in that role, I teach a lot about gender inequalities, and it's very easy when you're teaching about inequalities to become kind of very, very depressed about, the state of the world. But actually, Catherine and I were keen to show something very positive about the fact that, feminism has re-emerged in response to inequalities, and feminists are doing a lot to change and to challenge inequalities and to make the world a better place. We also think that, given all this media stereotyping of feminists, that actually the fact that about a quarter of the population identify as feminists, we think that's quite good. So instead of saying, oh, why doesn't anyone identify, why don't we say, well, it's great, a quarter of people in the UK, according to various surveys, say that they're feminists. That's brilliant. Let's capitalise on it. So, with an optimistic outlook, we wrote the book. Now, people often ask, what is feminism? And I'm sure that we have our different definitions of this. And this is my own one. So I think that it is about beliefs, it's about actions that challenge women's subordinate position and promote their equality and value alongside men. Now, of course, there are debates about whether feminism is just about women or whether it is about gender equality in general and about challenging gender stereotypes and not having to have, gender binary of only men and only women. What about intersex people? What about transgender people, etc.? So there's quite a lot of debate about the term feminism, what actually it means. But I do feel that there's something about it that has to be more focused on women, because it's women who are particularly subordinate group, but that gendered oppressions affect everyone in different ways, and they need to be challenged as well. And also that beliefs and actions go hand in hand. So personally, I think feminism's not just about thinking that there should be equality, but it's actually about doing something to try and promote that, whether that is just challenging a friend's sexist comment, or whether it's actually about going on a march or blogging, or, whatever it is that you can do. It's about doing something to improve the world. Okay, so with that background out of the way, what did we find when we did our research amongst feminists in the UK? Well, we did a survey in 2008 and 2009, which was a paper survey that went to a few different new feminist conferences. So, for instance, the Fem conferences in Sheffield, also the Ladyfest Arts Festivals, and then we had an online survey that went to lots of different feminist groups, often local feminist groups, so groups that had set up around, major cities, so London, Manchester, Newcastle, or areas of the country, such as South Coast Feminists is one group. And then we also sent the survey to some national issue-specific campaigns. So, for instance, the campaign Anybody, which is a body image charity, the group Feminist Webs, which is a feminist youth work network. We were targeting people who had become involved in manifestations of feminism that had started since the year 2000. So we were looking specifically at these new groups. to see, what they consisted of. So although a lot of people were still involved in older groups, for instance, Women's Environmental Network, Rape Crisis, we were targeting specifically the new groups. Okay, so that's what we did. And we received in the end nearly 1,300 responses to the survey. So this is who the feminists were then. So in terms of how they identified their gender, as you can see, 91% identified as female. Their age, a lot of them, as you can see, were very young. And, this is perhaps because we were looking at new groups that had been started up. The ages ranged between 15 and 81, and I'm happy to report that the 81-year-old was a man, which I thought was great, but they're mostly in their 20s and 30s. Now, in terms of ethnicity, these figures are quite complicated because instead of giving boxes to tick what their ethnicity was, which perhaps we should have done, we asked people to describe their ethnicity in their own terms. But then when we tried to categorize that became a little bit complicated to code. Some people confused ethnicity and nationality. For instance, a few people wrote Cornish, and then we thought, what do we do with that? What you can see, really, is that the ethnicity figures are sort of broadly representative of the population in terms of the proportion of people who are white. Black and Asian feminists were underrepresented, but feminists of mixed ethnicity were overrepresented. Now, in their education, they were very highly educated, and again, this is probably to do with the fact that this was mostly an online survey, so 90% of them had a degree or were studying for one. We asked about their sexuality, which was something that I found particularly interesting, because I don't think anyone has ever done any research on feminist sexual identifications, and what we found from that is that in a way fitting the sort of lesbian stereotype, there were more lesbians than in the general population or bisexual women. And around 6 in 10 identified as heterosexual, and the rest was something else. And we might think, well, why is that? So why is it that feminists are, less likely to be heterosexual? And maybe it's something about feminism that makes people reflect on their own sexual identifications, that gives them other options. I don't know, it's a complicated thing, but it's also quite interesting. Now, what about religion, then? We asked them this question: could they describe their religious or spiritual views? And then they were able to write whatever they wanted on the survey, which we then categorized, and this is what it looked like, the figures. So you can see majority seeing themselves as atheists, as agnostic, or as having no religion. Now, obviously, as a Christian, I find this interesting. It's quite different from the general population, incredibly different from the general population. The majority of women in the general population identify as Christian. So we've got a clear mismatch. So there's obviously something going on. And we see two things going on, really. So we see that compared to British women, these feminists are significantly less supportive of traditional religion. And then we secondly see that they are somewhat more supportive of alternative forms of spirituality or non-institutional spiritualities. Now, why is that? Well, I'm trying to work out the answer to that. I think I've got sort of some of it. And I went back and interviewed 30 of the people who'd been surveyed, so a sample of the wider survey, and asked them more about their religious and spiritual backgrounds, practices, their views about the relationship between them and feminism. And of those 30, and obviously 30 is not a representative sample, but what you get from interviews is a lot of rich detail that you can't get from a survey. I asked whether feminism had influenced their religious or spiritual views, and this is broadly, what they said. So as you can see, most of them said yes, it had. and that they were concerned that women were subordinated within religion, and though some of them remained connected to a religion that they'd had in childhood, they often struggled with it. And this led some to rejecting religion. For the others, some of them hadn't been ever really connected to religion. So, in a sense, in the way that, a lot of Christians are socialised into faith through having parents who are Christians, actually a lot of these were socialised into agnosticism or lack of faith through having parents who didn't have a faith either. So, family influence is incredibly important. Now, why do they think feminism and Christianity are not compatible? Well, feminism has a strong connection historically to Christianity. Many campaigners for women's rights were Christian. They campaigned for women to have the vote, for women to be, for girls to be educated, for women to be able to keep ownership of their property when they married. They were involved in welfare work to improve the status of women, areas such as prostitution and education. And that was the case, in the 19th century, probably up to the early 20th century. But more recently, the second wave of feminism in the 60s and in the 70s was dominated by women critical of religion. By the second wave of feminism, feminism had essentially become secular. And its association with secularism, I think, is partly why these feminists today, who you encounter in feminist groups, think religion is to be avoided. Now, let's look at that in a bit more detail. So what did this second wave feminists say about religion? Well, there were two influential groups. The socialist feminists and the radical feminists. And both criticised religion. So socialist feminists, so following Karl Marx, saw religion as an instrument used by the rich capitalists to keep the poor oppressed. So by telling them that their salvation would come in another life, they should be obedient to their employers now. Capitalists were therefore able to oppress the poor and prevent them from challenging the awful working conditions they suffered. Socialist feminists also critiqued capitalism's creation of the nuclear family, which splits the home from the workplace, makes men the breadwinners, while women had to do the domestic work and childcare at home unpaid, and that also women, of course, had to working class women particularly, had to work as well as doing all of that. Now, of course, that arrangement of the nuclear family under capitalism worked okay, for some women, for some middle-class women and women with generous husbands, women who were happy to take on those roles. It didn't work for those with violent husbands, mean husbands, unreasonable husbands, and women found themselves virtual slaves within their homes, unable to escape abuse, say, because they had no means of financial support. And so that has been the socialist feminist critique of the nuclear family and also of religion. And I think the socialists had a good point. I think they have a good point still. Capitalism is very bad for gender equality. It does oppress the poorer sections of society in order that the rich can make profits. And it can be risky for women to be economically dependent on male partners. But I think that the way that they dismissed religion as just oppressive was unhelpful. Now, then we come to the radical feminists. So what about them? Well, that was a very important strand of feminism too. Radical feminists believed that instead of capitalism being the engine of women's oppression, instead it was patriarchy or male domination. So they argued that patriarchy was a system within which men exploit and dominate women. They wanted to end patriarchy. They pointed out the great extent of patriarchal power, especially through men's violence against women, and also through men's control of women's sexuality. Prostitution, pornography, domestic violence, rape were topics that they were very, very concerned about. And they were the group that were behind the establishment of many of the women's refuges and the rape crisis movement, incredibly important. So they did a lot of excellent work. But having said that, it wasn't always clear how they would bring about an end to patriarchy. Some things they tried to do were providing women with safe spaces. Say, again, women's refuges would be an example of that. Agitating for better laws about sexual violence and domestic violence. There were different strands of radical feminism. So one strand saw initially, and I think this kind of died down a bit, but saw reproduction actually as the cause of women's oppression. So another one said that all men were socialized to be patriarchal and to dominate women, and therefore heterosexuality was bad for women, so women should all avoid heterosexuality and cultivate relationships with women. So there were lots of different strands of it, but it was all kind of about male domination being the problem. Celebration of motherhood was part of radical feminism too. So the one group said they wanted to end reproduction or take it out of women's bodies. Others said, no, we must celebrate women's, nurturing capacity, and it's kind of freedom from men, and men can't, get at motherhood. So if we then bring in God to the radical feminist argument, they saw God as a manifestation of patriarchy and therefore rejected religion as being oppressive for women. So I think radical feminists also did a lot of good, but sometimes, though, their critique of patriarchy became a critique of men in general in a problematic way, including also becoming a critique of God, of monotheistic religions in general. So, I'm supportive of both of these kinds of strands of feminism, but I don't think that they tell the whole story. So I think this is why we need Christian feminism. So today, feminists are inheriting this legacy, I think, and I think this explains why they are so suspicious of religion. However, as I also mentioned, many feminists do have spiritual practices. And I wanted to just take you through some interview quotations that came from some of these interviews with these 30 feminists that I did that show this. And what comes out for me really clearly from these is that for feminists, spiritual practices, not just beliefs or kind of, orthodoxy, is what is important. The practice of spirituality and the daily nature of spirituality is very important for them. So if we start with, this is someone called Lynn. And Lynn said that she had no religion. She was raised by atheist parents. She had a Christian grandmother. She talked about having values and beliefs, but wouldn't call them Christian. She said she believed in energy and balance, but wouldn't call them God. She believes that good actions are very important. They will reap rewards. And she uses this illustration of driving karma. So she says, if you do something good, that makes you a good person. Good things will happen to you. If you've got good driving karma, you'll get a space at the car park. But if you've got bad driving karma, you won't get a space at the car park. So I often think, how can I go about something the right way? And I don't know if I'd call this meditating, because I haven't decided if this is a religion or this is just what most people do. But I take time out every day and think, am I doing it right? Have my actions today made the world a better place? Or do I just need to do some recycling? Now, a few of the interview participants did still associate with Christianity or with Islam. So Beth was raised Catholic. She had a strong faith in childhood. She even wanted to be a nun. And she developed as a teenager socialist political views and then rejected the Catholic Church's view of abortion. She went to university. She attended a Christian group, but became critical of the way the Bible was used against women. She put it like that. And these attitudes distanced her from the church. but she still identifies as Catholic. She goes to confession occasionally. She does the rosary. She's moved by Christian art and music. She sings hymns while she's doing the washing up. And she talked about really liking ritual. She said, I like the aesthetics, which is part of why I like Ash Wednesday and Palm Sunday. You've got the symbols and the crosses. And I like that sort of thinking about the way we develop these traditions, how old they are, how they must have come. You know, it all develops slowly. I like feeling part of that history. And then she talked about, has anyone ever come across this poem? It's called God Says Yes to Me, and it depicts God in female terms. It's a really, really interesting poem. Do look it up afterwards, by Kaylin Horton. She said she really loved this poem and she had it on her wall. She was very much aware that Christians were often debating equality issues, but she said that she thought Christianity had made her more open-minded and not less. Okay, now let's have a look at Melanie. So Melanie was a Buddhist Anglican, and this is quite interesting as well. We found this quite a bit, actually, this sort of fusion of two religions, or someone saying, like, we had someone who said, I'm an atheist pagan. So this blurring of boundaries that we would traditionally expect to be there is something that you see amongst feminists a lot. So Melanie had quite a strong connection to Christianity in childhood. She'd been christened at the age of 10. She and her father had gone to lots of different churches when she was a teenager. She went to university. She then came out as a lesbian, and she abandoned Christianity as being oppressive and patriarchal. So she did kind of take up this sort of radical feminist narrative. She was then later in life, quite recently actually before the interview, encouraged by some Jewish friends to return to church. And she also attended a Buddhist retreat because her partner was Buddhist. She took up Zen Buddhist meditation classes and she started to attend church regularly at the same time. She got on well with her vicar, she joined the Sunday Bible reading rota, but she said she was disappointed at the lack of religious practice that she observed in the church, you know, just other than, say, reading the Bible or prayer. And she talked about how Quakers were really inspiring to her because they seemed to integrate faith into their lives in a way that she would like. She said, my vicar's clear. It doesn't matter whether you go to church or not. What matters is what you do. But as an Anglican, I don't think it's really in our consciousness about the real everydayness of it. For me, it's about the everyday, the details of how we treat each moment of every day, how we treat each other. It's really important. I like that word practice because that's all you do. You're practicing. Practice, practice, practice. I'm not a Buddhist or a Christian. I'm practicing. Which I really like, and I've kind of used that quote since then in a couple of things I've written, because, you know, this notion of feminists want to practice goodness and they want to practice, you know, spirituality and religion is quite strong. And then the last quote I'm going to show you is from someone called Sonia. Well, actually, Sonia was not her real name, I should say. These are all pseudonyms. She had rejected Christianity in her late teens, in preference for Wicca and paganism. She described paganism as, I quote, an earth-based spirituality with magic and witchcraft involved. She practiced spell work and she likened that to prayer. So she said, there are similarities. Whereas a Christian or Muslim would pray to their God, my spell is a kind of interactive version of that. I talk to what I presume to be sort of a deity in my head. Not as a sort of kneel down, put my hands together, but if I want something to happen, I might do a ritual that essentially is kind of asking for that to happen. But I send emotion, my energy, to get it to happen. But then I would add into that normal things. So the classic one is hunting for a job or partner. You do all the rituals in the world, but if you sit in your living room or your garden, you don't do anything about it. It's not going to turn up on your doorstep. So these are four very different women, but for each, spiritual practices were important. So this makes me think, we know as a Christian feminist, you know, what can we learn from these women, and how might Christianity speak to them? You know, is it they are rejecting a certain kind of Christianity that's about adherence to particular doctrines? and they don't see the presence of a Christianity that's about faith and doing good. I don't know, possibly. So I think part of what we wanted to do when we founded this network was to try and build bridges with feminists, to try and sort of present a good face of Christianity to them. What I would like us to do now, just before I finish talking for about 10 minutes or so, was for us to just have a chat where we are. Perhaps if we can just move, so we're in sort of groups of 3 or something like that, 2, 3 or 4, and just chat for about 10 minutes around these 2 questions. So, do many of the people you know consider themselves feminists, and what do you think a Christian response to feminism should look like? So we'll have about 10 minutes now. So if you want to do that now, you might need to move seats depending on where you're sitting. I just wanted to finish, so I'll just talk for possibly 5-10 more minutes, and just talk about some of the positive things that we found about the resurgence of feminism. So we asked them some things like, why did you become interested in feminism in the first place? And what was the thing that came out most strongly was that those of them, and this was about half of them, who had found feminism later in life rather than feeling they'd always been a feminist, education was very, very important in finding feminism, particularly doing, say, feminist modules at university, or doing A-level sociology, or a history course, and thinking about suffragettes, etc. So education was very, very important. There's a couple of stories about how people came to feminism as well that talk about, feeling a social pressure to fit in some kind of ideal, and then starting to think feminism might provide them a way of understanding their experiences of inequality, and then to then be able to challenge them. There were also people who talked about having been subject to violence by men, and this has made them think about, problems women in society face, and how they might then take on feminism as a way of, helping them. Well, as this one put it, in the hope that one day women will be able to walk on their own freely and confidently as men can. We had, as I mentioned, quite a number of men as well in the survey sample, well, sort of up to 10%, it was slightly below, I think, which obviously is not brilliant, but it's good that we found some men calling themselves feminists. So there's this one particular man here who talked about going out with his rampagingly feminist girlfriend, who he married, and then became a feminist as a result of this. And actually some men were quite wary about whether they were allowed to identify as feminists or not, or if they, feminists would say to them, how dare you, you're trying to take our territory. But I mean, most feminists, almost all feminists in the survey also believe that men could be feminists, and that they should call themselves feminists, and that everybody needs to work together for the cause of feminism. The issues that they were most interested in were around work, home, education, work-home balance, childcare, equal pay. Also issues related to violence against women, particularly concerned about rape and rape conviction rates. There are other issues as well, such as abortion, which came under the body theme, popular culture, sex and relationships. So this is sort of the issues they were interested in. They were involved in a lot of different kinds of activism. So probably the most popular kind of activism they did was things that you could do on your own, like responding to comments on Facebook, writing a blog about feminism, challenging sexist remarks that you heard people making. But there were also a lot of people involved in a lot of group activism, so going on protests. So this is the Slut Walk London protest a couple of years ago, which was actually quite controversial amongst feminists, but I think was also a really positive and kind of celebratory type of march, as well as raising awareness of a very important issue. Making homemade magazines, so known as zines. The top picture on the right is of a zine stall at a feminist conference. And then protests about violence against women. So the poster at the bottom is for the Million Women Rise March, which is the one that's happening next week in London that we're going to go to. Now, what are the similarities then? That's Everyday Sexism, of course, is a very important campaign that's around now, and the Lose the Lads Mags one. Now, if we compare feminism today to the feminism of the 1960s and 70s, what we see is that there's quite a lot of similarities. So a lot of people concerned about issues of violence, issues about equality in the workplace, equal pay. But there are also some differences. So these were the demands constructed in the 70s by the women's liberation movement, some of which were achieved, so financial and legal independence, so women can get mortgages on their own, whereas they didn't used to be able to do that, for instance. Some of them just seem to be an impossible dream, such as free 24-hour nurseries. Some of them we theoretically do now have, also, like equal pay. We have law, legislation that says that it is illegal to pay women and men who are doing the same job different rates. So theoretically we have equal pay, although an individual has to bring a case and it's very difficult. So that's the demands then. Also, one of the issues that people raised was the fact that now we have legislation that we didn't have, but it can be very difficult to actually change people's attitudes, that you can't really legislate around attitudes. So we may have equality in paper now, but we often don't have it practically. So we need to change the way people think about things. Rape would be, I think, a classic case of that. If you think about, all the scandals we keep hearing on the TV about, public figures being charged with sexual assault. The case comes, and then, women aren't believed. And of course, we don't know whether the individual cases whether the men were guilty or not. But we see a lot of people being found not guilty, and we're aware that it's very difficult for women to bring a rape conviction, and we're aware that lots and lots of women reporting rape who then don't get believed. So that there are lots of issues about we may have a law, but where the jury's attitudes have sort of caught up with that, probably not. So changing attitudes is very, very important for feminists. We proposed in the book a list of 7 issues we thought that feminists were concerned about, that they needed change in. These are kind of broad themes. So in the book we talk about more specific examples sort of under each theme. And we wanted to bring religion into this because the feminists in the 70s, as I've mentioned, often didn't talk about religion, or just kind of saw it as patriarchal and rejected it. So we want religion to be on the agenda of feminists. And that was one of the things that I was very keen to do in the book, to make religion, to give religion a presence in the way it doesn't have in most feminist books. Okay, so to conclude, feminism really is alive and well in Britain. Many of us are part of it. Many of us are exploring becoming part of it. There are conflicts amongst feminists about many issues, and anyone who's on Twitter, I'm not on Twitter, partly because I'm scared of all these quite unpleasant debates that people get into and being attacked and all sorts of things. There are a lot of conflicts amongst feminists about a whole range of really important issues. But also, I think we can kind of come together with some key, demands and messages to improve the situation for men and for women as well. So, as a Christian, I believe that gender equality is part of the message of Jesus. That is why I got involved in feminism in the first place. And so I hope that I've given you a bit of an insight into the wider feminist movement. And I see ourselves as, absolutely fitting within this movement, but also offering something that's a challenge to it as well, and inviting feminists to consider the claims of Jesus and to consider Christianity as something very important, I think, that we can bring to them too. Okay, how are we doing for time? 5 to 12. Natalie, what should we do? Do you want to take over?